third speaker for this outreach session is Dr. Jennifer Mather from University of Lethbridge. Jennifer was born and raised in Victoria, BC, pursuing her undergrad degree just a ferry ride across at UBC, followed by a master's in biology in Florida State. Dr. Mather moved to the psychology department at Brandeis in Boston to work on the behavior of octopuses. And I have to admit, I thought it was octopi until I read yeah, she's shaking her head at me. I know she was going to correct me on that. So octopuses. She went on to complete a doctorate in human sensory motor coordination and pursue a research fellowship in that area. But all the while she was continuing her animal work. Now, I want to point out, as a teacher and one who adopts the same approach, I love seeing that as a psychology prof in 1985 at University of Lethbridge, she adopted student-centered inquiry-based learning.
You bet.
That led her to partner with organizations across the world, get her students to really learn a larger classroom than just what you see in, the 70 to 20 student undergraduate classroom, depending on what year course that is. But I'm glad to see that she was recognized in 2017 by the Distinguished Teaching Award at the University of Lethbridge. So apart from the psychology courses that she teaches, Dr. Mather has continued her work on octopuses, and she's going to be talking to us today about something kind of cool. And so I'm going to turn it over to her without any further ado. I am going to be sharing the screen from my side, but she's going to be presenting.
Thanks, Karen. Am I coming through?
Yes, fantastic.
Good. Okay. I wanted to begin with to kind of apologize for my particular presentation because it doesn't have an awful lot to do with astronomy. But take a deep breath, enjoy the change of pace, enjoy the change of focus. Now, as a biologist, basically, when somebody said octopuses as aliens from space, I thought, what? And I really didn't pay too much attention to the details. And it's been kind of fun to do this for this presentation because I've had to think about why would people think that octopuses were aliens from space? Yes, can I have the next slide? And it turns out it's not just a bunch of kooks, it's actually a bunch of cosmologists. And I understand a little bit more from figuring out what cosmologists are. Apparently, there are people who imagine things in space, far past Earth, come up with ideas, so not necessarily ideas that are turned out to be correct, which is fair. Oh, I don't know, cephalopod biologists are kind of crazy too. But one of the things they said is that they thought that Earth was populated from space, particularly in the Cambrian explosion, and they thought that this was mostly viruses. But for some reason or other, they had a side look at this and they said, oh, but octopuses are smart and they're not like us, so they must have come from space. And this is the direct quote: cryopreserved squid and octopus eggs arrived in icy bolidays, which I suppose would be something like comets. Now, comets usually burn up on the way to Earth, so I'm not quite sure why they thought they didn't. But I thought, okay, why? Let me look at the evidence. Let's go from there. Next. Next slide. So their evidence consisted of 4 particular streams. First of all, they said that evolution should have gone from nautilus to squid to octopuses. Second of all, they said in the transition between nautilus and octopus, there's no fossil record, so maybe that's why they came from space. The third thing they said is that modern cephalopods can change their RNA, and I'll talk about that a bit later. And the fourth thing they said was octopuses are smart. Well, yeah, they are, but somehow or other there was the idea that they shouldn't be. Next slide. Well, let me go through them piece by piece, okay? First, the evolutionary route from nautiluses to octopuses. They've got it wrong. Now, if you look at the top line on that slide there, and I should say, by the way, Tanner and colleagues looked at the genetic makeup of all the present coleoids. And if you look at the genetic makeup of the present ones, you can go back to how are they related and where would the common ancestor be. So if you look at this, nautilus is not the ancestor of the coleoids. In fact, belemnoids were, but that's beside the point. Fairly early on in evolution, there's a division between the octopuses and the squid and cuttlefish. So they've got the evolution wrong. And we do have evidence for that. Next slide. The other thing they said, which is very interesting to think about, is, oh, there's no evidence of this transition. Well, there is some, and there isn't very much. On the other hand, it's really easy to see why there isn't very much evidence. Nautilus fossils are seen all over the rocks. They're very, very common in the period in which they thrived, but they're shells. So it's not surprising that they're common. If you look at the squid, you find that there are very, very few fossils, though there are some. So here's an example. And there's a really good and simple reason for that. Nautiluses had shells, squid, octopuses, and cuttlefish don't. And when you die and decay, what's left of us is bones. Think of the graves in the residential schools that were discovering bones of children. If you look at Nautilus, you find shells. So sure, there's lots of evidence of Nautilus, and there's present evidence of squid and octopuses. But it's because of the preservation of the record that we can't find many, not because of some kind of assay from space. Next slide. Now, I thought this was an interesting comment. It is fascinating that coleoids can edit their RNA rather than their DNA. It's a very interesting ability, because what it means is the individual can adapt to the microclimate without passing it on to the offspring, who can find another microclimate. And it's true that it's common in coleoid cephalopods and very uncommon in the rest of the animal kingdom. But I don't really think of that as evidence of extraterrestrial origin. I mean, think of it this way. Starfish have no brain, but they do very well out in the ocean. And we don't say, well, because they have no brain and they're thriving organisms, therefore they must have come from space. Same with the coleoids. They have something very good, but that doesn't mean that they brought it from space. They can evolve it here. Next slide. And then there's octopuses being smart. Yes, I don't have any problem with that. But why would that be some kind of a departure from normality? Well, the biggest reason is that the present model of evolution of intelligence is what we call the social hypothesis. And I guess it was about 20 years ago, people particularly looking at the primates said, the pressure to evolve high intelligence comes from trying to solve social problems, not trying to solve ecological problems like how do I find food and how do I avoid being eaten, but how do I manipulate somebody else to do what I want them to do? How do I figure out what they're thinking so I can get past them? How do I foster the development of my children, and how do I communicate with other members of our species? Just like, of course, we do. Along with that, they argued, well, big brains, a long life as we have, parental care so that you can help your offspring to survive through the first few years of life, and complex societies. These all come together in a package, and therefore intelligent animals are animals that have this particular capacity, especially, by the way, figuring out what somebody else is thinking. Next slide. So if we have a different model of intelligence and we can't believe that it evolved on Earth, why is it that we just can't believe in this kind of thing? And I think one of the reasons is what I call anthropocentrism. We would like to think that our species is the center of the universe. Okay, nice and simple. And this goes all the way back to Aristotle. I love his Scala Naturae, by the way. It started with minerals it worked its way up through simple animals to more complex animals. Notice, and it then goes to us humans and to angels, who are the superior form of life. We have inherited that in Western philosophy. It's not that we believe it, but it just sort of permeates the back of our thinking. And we move that into the doctrine of the Christian church, which is that man has dominion over the earth. Not as man, but anyway. And it also moved to one of the earlier philosophers, Descartes, who said, people have souls, and so we have to pay attention to them and take care of them. But animals are just automata. We can do anything we like to them. Now, of course, animal welfare has come a long, long distance since Descartes, but there are still people who think of us as having dominion over the earth, being in control of everything, and being inherently superior. And that fits very nicely with the social hypothesis of the evolution of intelligence. Okay, we are the most complex species, the species most involved in learning. We have the most complex societies, so therefore we're the best. So I think that's why we paid so much attention to this social hypothesis, because it fits with our assumption of primates as the most intelligent and capable, and us as the most intelligent and capable of the primates. Next slide. This is what evolution's really like, okay, guys? So over on the very left-hand side, you see the branch of the diplurula and the deuterostomes, which is chordates, and we're hung over there near the chordates. Notice the echinoderms, the starfish and the sea urchins and the sea cucumbers, they're over there fairly related to us. And the completely different branch, the protostomes, you find the mollusks, like the cephalopods, the arthropods, the annelids, and the echoroids. And by the way, if you look at what species dominate the planets, in terms of number, it's the arthropods, the crustaceans and the insects. And one of my favorite quotes about this was Darwin, when some priest, I believe, asked if he could think of what God's favorite species was. And I'm sure that this individual thought that Darwin would say Homo sapiens. But in fact, Darwin said it must have been the beetles. There's so many of them. And that's fascinating to think about. We don't dominate in terms of numbers, even in terms of number of species. We just think we're great. Next slide. Okay, I did promise to talk a little bit about octopuses. It's true, even though they're not related to us, they're very intelligent. We see it particularly in the fact that they're in an environment with lots of different predators, with lots of different prey species. The environment is complex and quite changing, okay? The coral reef system, by the way, is the most complex ecosystem of the planet. Not the most complex in the sea, the most complex on the planet, okay? And if you evolve there, you better know what you're doing. Octopuses can learn just about any style of learning, any type of learning, any situation that you might give them. They can do observational learning, they can do spatial learning, they can do lots of different ones, okay? They can do habituation. Like us, they're learning specialists. But one of the things that we tend to think about when it comes to what makes our species special, and by the way, we as humans have lots and lots of examples about people who say, well, man the tool user, or man the, I don't know, some kind of other ability. We are dominant and special because we can do these things. And man the tool user was quite popular about 25 years ago. And then people started looking at animals and they discovered there are an awful lot of species that also use tools. And one of my favorites with the octopus is that they have the mantle around their body, which contracts and expels water, just like we would blow out water with our mouth. And the octopus has taken that jet of water and used it for a whole lot of different things. So they use it to clean out a potential home that they might want to live in. They use it to jet backwards to escape from predators. They use it to throw out pieces of shell after they've finished their meal. And they occasionally use it to repel scavenging fish that are coming too close. And once in a while, scavenging researchers that are trying to figure out what they had for dinner. One of my favorites, to show you just how far they've taken the use of this particular tool, comes from the Seattle Aquarium. They had an octopus, a big octopus, because they are big occasionally, and it was in a tank underneath a light that was left on permanently. Now, of course, most of the lights are off at night, but this one was left on permanently so the caretakers could go around and see what was going on. And the octopus didn't like being illuminated. So it reached its flexible siphon up to the surface of the water, jetted a jet of water at the light, and shorted it out. And then it got what it wanted. But in some ways, the most interesting thing for me about octopuses is that they are very curious. They explore all the time. Anything that comes within their reach, they will reach out, try to pull in, figure out what to do with it. And they don't just pick up things and bring them, actually they bring them to their mouth to figure out what they are. They also will manipulate an item over and over sometimes and play with it to figure out, as someone said, not just what is this object, but what can I do with this object? So yes, they are intelligent. The cosmologists were right about that one. But does that make it a different model? Well, it does and it doesn't. We have a big brain, and octopuses have a big brain, even by mammalian standards. So that the octopus brain-body ratio is what you have to use. It's about the same, I think, as the lab rat and probably the cat. Probably more interesting, they have an area called the vertical lobe, which does all the integration of information. It takes in sensory information, makes decisions, stores learned information. So they have a control center. So we've got a cortex for a control center, and they have the vertical lobe for a control center. But here we have a big difference. Octopus has a short lifespan. A lot of the small species live 6 months. Most of the common ones, like the one you saw in my octopus teacher, would live a year, maybe a year and a half. The giant Pacific octopus, which gets to 25 pounds, in fact, maybe 3 or 4 years. And the question is, well, why would you bother to be able to learn all these things if you weren't going to have a lifespan like we have, or the elephant has, of decades? And I think the answer to that one is there's extraordinary evolutionary pressure. Remember this very complex environment. They have to learn because they have to get it right. The other thing that they absolutely counter, the social hypothesis, is these are solitary animals. Once in a while you find a species that's not, but by and large they are, okay? And sometimes they're cannibalistic. So not on purpose, they don't go out hunting each other. On the other hand, what it means is, to some extent, an octopus better be looking around every time it sees anybody, including another octopus, because so they'd be casual cannibals. But you don't want to be a little guy and be too near a big guy. Now, the last thing is different kind of control. So 3/5 of the neurons are out in the arms. So if you can give me the next slide, Karen. This is difficult to take into pieces, but think of it this way. In the center, you have the brain. It does sensory processing, learning, motor commands. But those 3/5 of the neurons out in the arms do an awful lot of lower level processing. In some ways, I think of them as subroutines, okay? So each arm, it turns out, has a chain of ganglia. Each ganglion controls one sucker. Suckers have sensory information. Suckers can do movement. So a sucker can pick up a small snail and pass it to the next sucker and so on. And there is coordination amongst the arms. If you chop the arm off an octopus and you keep it moist, it will walk down the bottom of the petri dish, or if you have it in your hand, it'll walk down your hand. And if you chopped off our arm, it would fall on the floor, okay? So it's very clear there's a lot of local control. And there's not as much feedback to the brain as we have. So it's not a highly centralized nervous system. But if you've been reading the social media, let me counter immediately. The arms don't have brains. There's only one brain, there's only one control center, but it does allocate a lot of processing to the arms, to the periphery. I might say it lets them make lower level decisions. And it's probably a good thing because there's all those arms, they have to have some kind of local control because there's so many of them and they extend so far and they do so many things. Next slide. So it's not social pressure that leads to octopus intelligence. So why did they get smart? If they didn't just come from space, why did they have to get smart? It'd be one way to look at it. I just mentioned the marine nearshore environment, didn't I? That it's a complex environment, especially think of if you lived in the intertidal, which not that many octopuses do because it has real problems. The currents wash on you, the wind pushes you around, the tide comes in and out. There's a lot of oxygen. It's a very good environment to live in. I think okay, interbrachial commissure. I'll break for that one. How's that? At the base of the arms, there's a neural loop around linking arm nerve to arm nerve. So there is some coordination between what an arm's doing and what another arm next door is doing. And if you look at a reaching task, for instance, you find that if the animal reaches with one arm and then it gets complicated and wants to use another, it uses the next arm over. I call that a neighborliness principle, okay? So there is not just some coordination within the arms, there's also some coordination of the arms collectively. Now that there's a lot more I could say about that on account, okay. Probably the most basic evolutionary pressure that has led octopuses to this intelligence is the loss of the shell. And it's a really fun, I hate saying it that way because it's like they pick up the shell and they threw it away. Nope. It was a long evolution. But they did evolve so that they have no spines, usually not any toxins, no sort of place to hide. So the only way that they're going to make a living is by their wits. They have to. And it's not the case that they dropped the shell and then said, now what do I do? It's the case that gradually they evolved to be more and more intelligent as they had less and less physical protection. The other thing that's probably going on about the same time is that the bony fishes were evolving at the same time that these soft-bodied cephalopods were evolving. And the bony fishes are smart, varied, and in the seas at the time, they became very, very successful, and they still are very successful. So in a sense, the coleoids are keeping up with the evolution of a completely different group, the fishes. And these together are probably the reasons, like it or not, that the cephalopods evolved to be those most interesting and most intelligent animals here on Earth. Next slide. Okay, I can spend a little time talking on this. Karam, how much time do I have? I can see how much time I can free associate.
We're at the end, but I think we can go through this and then open up for questions.
Okay, well, I'll do this fairly quickly. Does the fact that we know that octopuses are intelligent and they don't look like us help us to understand how extraterrestrial intelligence might look? Maybe. Different from us, but I suspect it will be more different than what we're looking at on Earth. But what's probably the most important is it takes us away from our narrow assumptions of how intelligence evolved and why it's important for us to be running the Earth. So we have to say, guess what, I'll look a bit wider. And I also have this assumption that we ought to be looking for more models on Earth. So we said, okay, we've got the model, and now we know, no, we don't. We have another model. And there are probably other models for how animals are using intelligence. We just don't know enough about it yet. It might be the social insects. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. By the way, when I was preparing this, oh, come on back to it for a minute, Karen.
Yep.
When I was preparing this, I thought, okay, if you really want to think about different in terms of evolution of life on Earth, you should look in the deep sea for some of your models. And so clustered around the side of that slide, you have a couple of pictures of deep ocean animals. I have always thought, by the way, that the science fiction people ought to just go down to the deep ocean and look and see what they can find for animals. And then they would have wonderful models, because some of the deep ocean animals are really different. It was fun to find them.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
They're
Questions?
fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Mather. And yeah, let's open up for questions. I'm going to
I'll say thank you for that, Dr. Mather, on behalf of the society. It's that was amazing. I've got a frogfish for you in the background. I changed my background while my camera was on.
I think they're poisonous.
They
You don't want to step on them.
You don't want to go. No, I just they're quite elusive, and they're chameleon as well. I've always found I love finding octopus diving, and I find that if I drop down below where the octopus is and just stay there and don't move, eventually they become curious enough and they'll take a peek over the reef, and until they finally come out, just to see who that character is. It's amazing how curious they can be.
They're very curious, and I think that's the basic survival strategy.
Yeah.
What I was going to say as you were saying this, that in fact, that should be the basic rule for snorkelers or scuba divers. Stop where you are and let things come out.
Absolutely.
And then you find a fascinating array of animals. Yeah, I'm afraid
Like,
I'm in love with the oceans.
Like this guy. I mean, they're hard to find.
Samantha, I'd be happy to send you some papers. Actually, I'm co-author of a book that's 10 years old called Octopus, the Ocean's Intelligent Invertebrate. And that was Timber Press out of Oregon. That's actually, we wrote that for what I think is a wonderful audience for science, which is the intelligent, ordinary person who just wants to know more. So that's fairly digestible. That might help. Somebody had a question and then it went away.
I'll look for it. But Andy was mentioning My Octopus Teacher, and Roland mentioned that you were a consultant on that movie.
Yes, I was the scientific consultant of that movie, which was great fun. I mean, basically it got me a 10-day trip to South Africa, which I was delighted with.
So Lori had asked about the interracial commissure, but we did go back to that.
I did go back on that one. Yeah.
Tom Vassos is asking, if shells were helping octopuses survive in the past, why did they lose them to their evolutionary chain?
And it's a good question. I guess evolutionary pressure is very, very gradual. Okay. So it wasn't helping them as much as they thought it did. Or they were very heavy and you had to drag them around. If you look at a nautilus, a present day nautilus, okay, it's got a great big heavy shell with a whole bunch of chambers. And it doesn't by any means have anything like the speed of the modern octopuses. So that's probably why that every way of living in the real world has positives and negatives. Okay, and gradually the positives of being intelligent began to outweigh the negatives of having the heavy shell for the octopuses, not for everything.
Great, great. I'm seeing if there's any more questions in the chat. I don't see it. Oh, Lori, can I ask you to unmute and ask your question? Sorry, I'm trying to track through 3 different posts.
Yeah, sorry, I got messed up there. I just think what you were just talking about when you talk to young kids or middle school children, I mean, they're always asking about, you know, what they think aliens look like, or do you think there's really aliens in space and all that kind of thing. And I think that they don't need to go very far up into space. There's so many interesting creatures here, and that I'd love to be able. I mean, I think I will really try to kind of talk to them about how they don't have to go very far in order to find things that really are much more alien than what, as you say, our assumption and our vision of what intelligent creatures should look like. And it's gotten, I can kind of think about how I'd like to extend this so that that I'm asking those questions of the kids back to them. I'm not going to answer them. I'm going to ask it back. So thank you.
You know what I would do, I think it's NOAA, NOAA.
Yes.
They have an ROV, a roving undersea vehicle. And every summer they take the mothership and they go out to some area and they put this ROV down and they run it along the ocean bottom. And they have cameras and they have a grabber apparently. And they just sort of focus on this and just, it's like exploring what's going on there. And that would be an absolutely fantastic thing to key into. And the answer is yes, you're right. There are animals that we don't know anything about in the deep sea. Absolutely no question. And that is one way to get the kids going on that. But the deep sea animals are really cool.
I do like that it's referred to as the
Like
mothership.
us.
Yeah, I do like that it's referred to as the mothership. One thing that I wanted to I guess get your impression on, you shared the Aristotle's and Descartes' view on the superiority of man. But one of the things that I love is the First Nations who are in nature and working with the land and with the animals. If you look at most of their legends for the creation of the earth and their journey to Turtle Island, it's the animals that took care and showed the humans the way, and that the animals were actually the ones that were intelligent and the humans were the ones that were kind of floundering around automatons until they gained that intelligence. Is that part of what you're saying in terms of kind of abandoning the social model that we view for intelligence and the evolution of intelligence?
I teach a course called Human Animal Interactions. And one of the things I do at the very beginning is point out the different philosophies about animals. And then I ask the students to write their own philosophy. And the First Nations philosophy, that each animal is special in its own way, that each animal has its own wisdom, that each animal has its own niche in the planet. I love it. And I think if we could transfer more of that, we would have less of our human arrogance. And if I'm lucky, I don't know if we're going to be lucky, we might have less of our destruction of the planet. I find it difficult nowadays to talk about Homo sapiens when we're doing such foolish things to the planet we live on. But yes, other philosophies do need to be looked at, and other philosophies sometimes make more sense than ours.
And I love that you come at this from the psychological perspective as well as the biological perspective, and you were able to tie it into cosmology and space exploration. So that was fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Mather.